Chapter 3 Flood of Knowledge. Turaga Whenua peeked out of his living room window, watching the stir of the bustling Onukoro streets begin to dwindle as the day drew to a close. The sudden emergence of the Bohrok had disrupted the typical routines of many of the villagers that worked within the village limits, many of which watched the ensuing battle with the Toa from the safe distance of their homes and businesses. The damage from the battle, including Toa Onua's destroyed home, was still in clear view even long after the fight had reached its conclusion. The Turaga spent the next several hours working with the Afful regard to quell the villagers' rising concerns, assuring them all was under control and that the Toa would handle the rising threat. The site of the battle was off-limits to the public, at least until the Turaga learned more about these creatures. But in order to do so, he needed to wait. He continued to watch until the commotion of the day had died down and the streets were almost solely occupied by a few patrolling guards. He had instructed Onepu to keep their distance from his home during their patrols. Although the Afful captain was confused by the request, his trust and loyalty to his longtime elder was unquestionable. Only then was Whenua prepared to continue. After taking a final glance outside, he closed the shutters and covered the single light stone that dimly illuminated the room. He moved into his bedroom towards the small sleeping corner, which was cut out to be several inches lower than the rest of the floor. Unlike other Matoran races, the Onu Matoran seldom slept on actual beds, preferring to sleep as close to the earth as possible, and the Turaga was no exception. He stooped down, peeking over his shoulder before lifting the thin layer of padding to reveal a hidden cellar door underneath, a secret that no Matoran on the island had any knowledge of. He lowered his foot, probing until it made contact with the first ladder rung before climbing down, pulling the floor hatch shut above him. He activated his noble Ruru, granting him sight inside the pitch-black cellar. The room was compact with a low ceiling that his 5'2" frame nearly brushed against. It was obvious that he had not set foot in this place in years, or perhaps decades, as nearly every surface was covered in a layer of dust and cobwebs. The only items stored inside the room were a small reading desk tightly pressed against the reinforced stone wall, and the modest yet thoroughly filled bookshelf beside it, which held the many reasons for the Turaga's secrecy. He approached the bookshelf, wiping away the dust to get a clear view of the titles before making his selection. He was unsure which to select, as he was unsure which book would even contain the knowledge he sought. He could hardly remember the last time these pages were opened, but he was certain they held what he was looking for. It was likely going to be a long night. He ran his finger along the titles written on the spines. Many of the tomes were part of a large multi-volume collection. Unsure where to begin, he pulled the first of them from the shelf and placed it on the desk. He sat down, wiping away another layer of dust as he prepared to open it. He opened the hard cover and stared at the first page for a long moment. The Complete Compendium of Rahi Beasts, Volume 1. The most authoritative and comprehensive source on the Rahi beasts of the world, courtesy of the Onu Metru Archives. Below the title was a lengthy list of names credited to the contributors, all of which Whenua recognized, including his own. He slumped in his chair, experiencing an expected but no less sweeping rush of emotions engulfing his heart, each attached to a flood of memories of a forgotten time, a time before time. He shook the thoughts from his mind, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. He began flipping through the pages, skimming through every entry in search of his target. He found himself getting distracted numerous times, finding himself engrossed in entries entirely unrelated to the Bohrok before regaining his concentration. The first volume lacked the information, as did the second. After hundreds of pages of extensive and thorough knowledge concerning various Rahi, many of which he hadn't thought about in ages, he had finally found it. The Bohrok entry was much shorter than most of the others, even including a disclaimer that stated many things about them remained unknown, but still featured enough information that could aid the Toa. Much like the Matoran, 6 known breeds of Bohrok were documented, all with their own unique characteristics. Based on their description, he learned the ones that attacked his village were known as Nuvok, characterized by their black armor and ability to compromise foundations by tunneling underground. He read through the entries repeatedly, soaking up all the information until he committed it to memory. He was eventually forced to address the creeping headache that he had been ignoring since activating his mask. He released the power, rendering him totally blind within the pitch-dark cellar. He rubbed his eyes, allowing his mind to rest for a moment. He had no grasp of what time it was, having shut himself away from the outside world and immersing himself in ancient texts for what could have been hours. Unable to conjure up the mental energy to reactivate his mask, and having read over all he could at least 10 or more times, he decided it was a good place to retire for the night. He would begin his journey to Takoro first thing in the morning. Leaving the books on the desk, he stood up, reaching out for the ladder until it made contact with his hand. He climbed up, pushing open the cellar hatch and climbing out into the only slightly less dark bedroom. He shut the hatch behind him as quietly as he could before covering it back up with the bedding. He was prepared to simply slink directly into the bed before he was alerted by an unusual amount of commotion coming from outside the house. He rushed over to the window, seeing scattered groups of Usselry guards rushing through the village streets, many of which were riding their Ussel crabs. Just as he made for his door to investigate, a heavy and urgent pounding erupted from the other side.
Damek,
the Turaga said after immediately answering the knock.
What is going on out there?
Nothing good,
Damek replied.
We've got more of those things on their way.
Whenua swiped his staff from beside the door and followed the Matoran outside.
Where were they spotted?
They're coming through the lesser mine tunnels. They broke through from the reef and now half the mine is flooded.
How many?
Kaj spotted them first. He said he stopped counting after 100. If they keep breaking through the walls, they're going to flood the whole Koro.
That is their intention, Damek,
Whenua replied, recalling the information he had just learned.
These are Galak, and flooding is their specialty.
We'll tear them apart before they have that chance,
Damek replied with bold assurance.
No,
said the Turaga, stopping Damek from moving further.
Toa Anua is not here to protect us. We must evacuate the village.
And abandon Onukoro?
Turaga Whenua hesitated, pounding his staff on the ground in frustration.
Yes, there's no sense in drowning with it. Get the guards to withdraw their defense. Focus on getting the villagers to the surface. Hopefully my dad can spare his crabs for quicker transport.
Damek shook his head in reluctant compliance.
If you say so, Turaga.
Go now. We don't have much time.
As Damek rushed off to deliver the orders, the Turaga turned his attention toward rounding up the villagers. He ran down the street until he came across one of the most modest homes along the path. He pounded on the door unceasingly until it swung open, revealing the concerned resident inside.
Turaga? What's going on out there?
Taipu, I need your help.
The Turaga replied.
Of course, Turaga. What do you need?
Onukoro is under attack. I need you to help us get all of the villagers to the surface.
Almost before the Turaga had finished his sentence, Taipu was already outside. Without further questions, he had already begun shouting into windows and pounding on every door he came across. Soon after, dozens of confused and roused villagers emerged from their homes, demanding to know what was occurring outside.
Is everything all right, Turaga?
Asked one of the concerned villagers.
I'm afraid not, Azebo,
Whenua replied.
More of those Bohrok have invaded the Marne tunnels. We need to evacuate.
A gust of murmurs swept through the gradually growing crowd, voicing concern over the Turaga's report.
Evacuate?
Called one of the villagers.
Why not stay and fight? Yeah,
Agreed another.
we never evacuated when the Rahi attacked. How's this any different?
They've already begun flooding the tunnels.
Whenua replied.
If we stay and fight, we will all drown. This is not up for debate. Gather what you need and make for the surface. Quickly!
While the murmuring crowd grew louder, nearly all of the Onumatoran complied with the Turaga's orders. Many joined Taipu in alerting the remaining villagers, while the rest returned to their homes to gather their essential belongings. Sometime later, Captain Onepu rode in from the tunnels ahead of the other guards, halting his Afful mount beside the Turaga.
We've withdrawn our defense as requested, Turaga. Now they're coming this way. We did what we could to thin their ranks on our way out, but we were overwhelmed. The Mon tunnels are flooded entirely. I suggest we hasten our evacuation.
Turaga Whenua sighed.
So be it, Captain.
The evacuation commenced. The Usselry guards funneled the crowd into a tight line through the dark and winding tunnel that led up to the surface Wahi. The Turaga, Onepu, Taipu, and many Usselry guards hung back to ensure every villager had safely exited the Koro. All was moving according to plan, until a foreboding cluster of screeches rang out from the tunnels at the far end of the village. The guards readied their weapons as a swarm of blue Bohrok poured out into the village, scurrying along the walls and ceiling of the immense cavern. The vacating villagers quickened their pace, causing a brief jam along the exit. The Usselry guards that were not occupied with quelling the mob rushed out to face the inpouring swarm. They fired their crossbows, many of which either missed or bounced off the Bohrok headplates. As their numbers reached far beyond 100, the Galak promptly went to work at dismantling every obstacle they came across.
Why are they doing this?
Taipu asked.
Bohrok exist only to destroy.
Whenua replied.
They are weakening our structures so that the incoming floodwaters will be more effective at washing it all away.
More than 200 Matoran remained in Onukoro as the Bohrok struck at their homes. The guards attempted to fight them off with alarmingly limited success. The challenge of leading the villagers to safety had reached far higher when the cluster of Galak that had clung to the high ceiling had begun chipping away at the giant stalactites that hung over the village. The Matoran were forced to dodge the falling rocks that crashed down onto the streets and speared through rooftops. The few Galak working at this task that were successfully struck by crossbow bolts only added their own bodies to the falling debris. Only one Onumatoran had yet to join the evacuation. While the chaos raged outside, he remained inside his home, carefully skimming over a mess of tablets scattered haphazardly along a disorganized workbench before hastily stuffing them into a small supply bag. He periodically glanced out his window to observe the mayhem before turning back to his task. He was aware of the risk of sifting through these piles, and in his mind, the information they contained was worth it. At least some of it was. And he couldn't spare the room in his bag to simply take it all. Deeming what he had gathered to be sufficient, he slung the bag over his shoulder and rushed toward his door. As he was mere feet away from the handle, a thunderous crash shot into his ear holes as his roof caved in beneath a fallen stalactite. He failed to leap away as the middle truss that supported his home collapsed. A gust of air was launched from his lungs as he was pinned to the earthen floor by the broken log. His arm was wedged against his chest, rendering him unable to grab the beam. He tried to cry out for help, but struggled to generate enough noise from beneath the crushing weight to be heard through the commotion outside. The log was far too heavy to be lifted with his single free arm, even if he managed to position it correctly. Forcing his breath to steady, he scanned the room for ideas. The evacuation was nearly complete, as only a few dozen Matoran remained in the village, most of which were Usselry guards still fighting off the Galak. Another stalactite was loosened, causing it to fall onto the decorative archway branching out from the main tunnel. The stone structure tore apart, dropping down over the exit. The small cluster of Matoran braced as the massive archway toppled toward them, only for it to be stopped before they could be crushed.
Hurry!
Taipu called, straining to hold the immense stone pillar over his head.
I don't think I can hold it very long.
Seeing Taipu's arms buckling beneath the weight, Captain Onepu rushed to his aid, adding a fraction of support beside Taipu's impressive strength. The remaining Matoran funneled into the tunnel as the two Matoran held up the obstruction. The few Usselry guards spit their final crossbow bolts before ducking through the exit. Alerted by the two Matoran, a nearby Galak charged forward, attempting to prevent them from blocking the exit. Before it could reach them, Turaga Whenua leaped into its path, brandishing his drill staff. When the Bohrok lunged, he thrust the drill up beneath his upper jaw before switching it on. The creature's squeals were drowned out by the sound of warping and tearing metal as its head was twisted completely off of its body.
Hurry, Turaga!
Taipu strained.
Get out before it's too late.
Before Whenua could respond, his thoughts were interrupted by a distant crash on the far end of the cavern. Following a few more Galak was a rushing wave blasting through the Marn Tunnel entrance, sweeping through the village cavern. Homes, broken stalactites, and Bohrok, both living and dead, were washed away in the oncoming flood. The Turaga gritted his teeth as the waves pounded toward them. He rushed toward the two Matoran, ducking beneath them as they continued to hold up the archway. Once he was on the other side, he turned back to face them.
Come now,
He urged.
I'm afraid we can't, Turaga,
Onepu replied, fighting to hold the stone.
It's too heavy to maneuver.
hold still. I can use my staff to break up the stone.
There's no time, Turaga.
Taipu added.
Get out of here.
Remember your duty, Turaga,
Onepu said.
Get to Takoro. We'll be alright.
Whenua desired nothing more than to argue further, but the captain was right. He was the only one on the entire island with any substantive knowledge of the Bohrok swarms, and the island depended on this knowledge. Unable to form any more words, the Turaga forced himself to turn away, joining the others heading for the surface.
It looks like this is it, Taipu,
Onepu said.
Did everyone make it out?
I believe so. You've done well, my dear friend. You are a true hero.
Taipu smiled through his waning struggle.
I hope the Turaga tells Toho Nua. He'll be so proud.
Indeed he would. As am I.
Soon their combined strength gave out, forcing them to drop the broken archway. The two Matoran leaped back as the stone crashed at their feet. With the exit blocked, they turned to face the advancing floodwaters. Up on the surface, more than 2,100 Onu Matoran poured from the mouth of the cave, gathering across Midak's farmland. The tranquil moonlight and lightly chirping insects was a heavy contrast to the horrific destruction occurring below. Many Matorans sat in the grass, panting breathlessly from the strenuous escape up the rough and winding tunnel. The guards paced through the field, conducting a head count of all that escaped. Once their final tally was concluded, Damek approached the Turaga, who stared motionless into the mouth of the cave.
We're 3 Matoran short,
Damek reported with a sigh.
No one has seen Nuparu.
Consumed with grief, the Turaga hung his head. He looked up to see a gush of excess water seeping out of the cave. Without a word, he dropped his hand onto Damek's shoulder before turning east, beginning his long journey toward Takoro.